I finally have an AC unit, so temperature controlled environment invites some case temperature testing, one might say. Quarantine hair, YOLO. Good people, I'm Dmitry, and what we have here on the review table is the Be Quiet Pure Base 500DX. We saw this case at CES, and I gotta say, what they've done here is both competitive, affordable, and I'm hoping more companies follow in what Be Quiet is doing here. The 500DX is basically an airflow iteration of the Pure Base 500. You can check out that review over here, but the guts remain identical with a few exterior changes that make this a very competitive and an airflow excellent enclosure. So now that we find ourselves in a temperature controlled environment, I want to do some airflow testing, both move some fans around, add some fans, and see what is the most optimal fan configuration for an airflow focused enclosure like the 500DX with my airflow system configuration. And the reason why I think this testing will apply not only to the 500DX but many other cases in 2020 is because many brands are choosing the whole front mesh panel and including quality fans. So the 500DX, for example, comes with 3 140mm Pure Wings 2 fans which spin at 900 RPM. Don't worry about the lower RPM because the larger fan does move more air, and having non-restrictive front intake gives us fantastic intake, and also the 900 RPM gives us that whole Be Quiet operation, which they're obviously known for. So in this video, let's test out 7 different fan configuration options, all using 140mm fans, just so that we can utilize what is already included with the 500DX and see what fan configuration is best right after this.
The X299 CLX from ASRock is the best place to house your new Core X processor. It features aluminum alloy heatsinks with Dr. Moss's 13-phase power design for the best overclocking experience. It also has Wi-Fi 6 support, 3 M.2 slots, along with reinforced PCI brackets. Learn more down below.
Alright, so before we get into the airflow testing, let's quickly recap what is new on the 500DX. So obviously the front panel mesh is new. We have quite high density of the holes in both the left and the right side with that ARGB strip in the middle, and I do find their illumination implementation inside this enclosure quite tasteful. Plus we have an internal RGB strip inside the case that is not visible when the side panel is on, and it does help to illuminate whatever is in the top section of the case, and it does actually spill to the bottom all the way through the glass, creating this like pretty cool line at the bottom. I also really like how it illuminates the power supply shroud corner, so it helps to separate the internal sections. I think it looks quite nice. Obviously, you can change the color and modes of this ARGB strip with a button up top. And here we also find a Type-C connection, only a single USB 3 port, and I really do not like this pattern and this direction that many case brands are now doing. Now, the good thing about the front panel is that we have pegs instead of wires that connect the main panel to the contacts on the chassis, but it's really difficult to remove this thing. And one more thing, when reinstalling the panel, make sure all 3 pegs are making contact with that frame, because otherwise this front illumination will not light up. So behind this front mesh, we have a dust filter spanning the entire portion of that intake. And we also have a bottom dust filter removable from the front without the need to remove the front panel first. Nice. The glass panel is attached with regular thumb screws, and the rubber bits on the frame stay with the frame. They're glued there and they don't fall out when you remove the glass panel, which was the case with the Dark Base series. As for the top panel, we no longer have the closed off section. Now we only have the mesh magnetic plate, and behind it you can install dual 140s or 120s and their respective radiators. As for airflow at the front, you can do triple 120s or dual 140mm fans with their respective radiators too. As for the interior, nothing has changed here. ATX motherboard support, a perforated power supply shroud, dual SSDs beside the motherboard, and this nice little cable cover that hides whatever is exiting from the back. And the right side panel has some noise dampening foam applied to it that helps to compress some of the cables and just really dampen whatever is exiting through the right side of the case. I don't really have anything else new to say about the 500DX, so now let's begin the airflow experiment. I kept the room at 22 degrees Celsius. I have this thermometer with dual temperature probes, one I kept on the outside of the case to measure ambient temperature, just to make sure that my control point was on point and correct. And fluctuations for that temperature probe was only 0.1 degrees Celsius. I'm very happy about that. And the second probe I kept right above the VRMs on the motherboard just to see if a hot pocket would accumulate there, and if you add more fans or remove fans, what would happen to that space. So first, let's establish a reference point with our default fan configuration, out of stock cooling. Here we have 74 degrees Celsius and 78 degrees Celsius on GPU and CPU respectively. These are pretty decent temps, and that front panel is not a massive bottleneck for airflow. So we only drop 1 degree Celsius on the GPU and 2 degrees on the CPU with that front mesh removed. Now, removing the dust filter as well, so we have totally unrestricted intake. We do drop slightly on the CPU, but the GPU remains the same, 73 and 73. And the really interesting thing about the noise profile with the dust filter and the mesh removed is that they do dampen the sound a little bit, but it's basically like, it sounds like an open enclosure already, which is why having lower RPM fans helps a lot. This machine behind me has 6 fans running, and it's very quiet. Actually, the fan on my light is louder. I can hear it more than the system with 6 fans in it. So let's see if we can move some fans around and get better temperatures. So the first thing I wanted to do was move the top fan to the front, so both the CPU and GPU have that nice fresh column of air. And as expected, that fresh column of air does actually drop our CPU temperature by 3 degrees and only 1 degree on the GPU. And this is without adding any fans. We're just reconfiguring what is already here. In my testing previously with cases like the H510 from NZXT, having dual exhausts, one at the top, one at the rear, does actually help with CPU temperature, but that case has a pretty restrictive front intake, whereas here it seems like that benefit of having fresh air intake and having like plenty of exhaust at the back is enough to drop our CPU temperature by a little bit, and I welcome that. But what if we move those front fans to top exhaust? And this actually surprised me quite a bit, because our CPU temperature actually increased to 79 degrees Celsius. That is higher than our default control point, and the GPU temperature also increased by a degree. So it seems like having no intake inside the 500DX is not a good thing, and having everything being exhausted isn't enough to cool whatever is being accumulated inside the enclosure. I then decided to flip the top fans to intake air. The CPU temperature did drop to 78 degrees, so back to our control point, but the GPU actually increased in temperature. I'm guessing there's just nothing to remove whatever air is being accumulated at the bottom. And finally, let's populate all 140mm fan slots in here, having 2 at the front, 2 at the top, and 1 for exhaust. So I kept the top fans as intake and having 2 front fans delivering air, so there's a lot of intake happening here, and both the CPU and GPU temperatures reached a 74 degree equilibrium, giving us the coolest CPU temperature of 74 degrees Celsius, but still not too far off from the 78 degree of our control point. And finally, I rotated the top fans as exhaust, and weirdly the CPU temperature did go back to 78 degrees Celsius while giving us a nice cool GPU staying at 73. Now, what about that internal temperature probe above the VRMs? And as you can see, this space is only adequately cooled when there's intake of air either from the top or the front, with a good balance of temperatures when we reposition the top fan to the front. But what's really interesting here with the top fan set to exhaust, this area becomes really toasty because of competing airflow streams between the lateral CPU cooler and vertical top exhaust. So something that should be mitigated if you rotate the CPU cooler. And it seems like for this type of mid-tower, if we don't have enough front intake, GPU temperatures suffer, and if we don't have enough top exhaust, GPU temperatures suffer again. And the most interesting thing here is that if we have all fans populated, the best configuration is have both top intake and front intake as well, gives us better CPU and GPU temperatures at 74 degrees Celsius. But the second next best configuration is to simply move that top fan to the front intake, which is pretty surprising. But then maybe we're encountering the law of diminishing returns of like adding too much airflow where the components are adequately cooled already out of the box. For my concluding remarks, this whole thing has been quite interesting, being in a temperature controlled environment and playing with some variables to see what happens with our GPU and CPU temperatures. And the most impressive thing is you don't need to buy any more fans. Simply relocating the top fan to the front will improve both GPU and CPU temps. And if you really want to go all out and having the best temperatures inside this enclosure, then in my testing, having intake at the top is better than exhaust for the CPU, and as long as you have adequate intake for the front, GPU temperatures will not suffer. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I'm really interested to test this type of airflow configuration with many other airflow mesh front enclosures coming up in the future, like the Fantex P500A coming out, something from Lian Li with the Lancool 2. So yeah, let me know in the comments what do you think of this experiment, and potentially move your fans around to see what gives you better temperatures. I'm Dmitry, thanks so much for watching. Check out this other relevant content, subscribe for more, and I'll talk to you in the next video.